First, we have Brown versus the Board of Education, which was in 1954. Some of the key points include, under the 14th Amendment, it was ruled unlawful to discriminate arbitrarily against groups of people. And then the second point is this brought light to the idea of integration to public schools. So because you couldn't discriminate and you couldn't separate people, you found a way to integrate them into a whole group. Some of the implications of this for ELLs include, in an ELL's education, ELLs can be separated from other students at all times, can't be separated from other students at all times. And students also need equal educational opportunities, which means better bilingual programs. And for special education, its schools could not discriminate against students with special needs. Some of the limitations include, for both ELLs and special education, would be the start of integrating ELL and special education students could have a rough transition. Okay. Title VII Bilingual Education Act, which went from 1968 to 2002. The key points include it gives federal funding to school districts so they can aid in bilingual education. So schools will get more money for bilingual education. And by 1994, Title VII had more clear and defined meaning and expectation. Because at first it was originally very unclear and they had loose definitions and it led to almost chaos. Some of the implications for ELLs include, by 2000, 32 states had similar policies that allowed for education in the student's home language. And it also furthered the understanding of personal and social benefits of bilingual education. Some of the limitations include, for ELL, until 1994, the definitions and meanings of Title VII were very unclear, causing confusion and disagreement with policymakers and educators.
So the Section 504 of the Vocational Rehabilitation Act. This act was made in 1973, corresponding with special education, and was the first disability civil rights law to be put in place. The law prevents discrimination against all individuals with disabilities in programs that receive federal funds. This also ensures equal opportunity for participation for the full range of school activities. And in order to qualify, students must have a physical or mental impairment that limits one or more major life activity. Some implications are that they may be entitled to receive specific types of assistance to help them succeed in school. And in school, they can be given different accommodations such as extended time on tests, reduced homework, verbal texting, modified textbooks, and much more. Some limitations are that not all students are eligible through special education because they must meet, again, like those certain qualifications.
Next one was, I don't know how to say it correctly, but it was Lau versus Nichols. So my key points was Chinese speaking children. They were all Chinese speaking children. So Lau was a father and he filed suit because he felt it violated their 14th Amendment, which is race, color, and national origin. This case was mainly about ELL students who were enrolled in a school in San Francisco, and they were just placed into a regular class, even though they knew very little English. So pretty much they were put into a class and the teachers knew that they didn't know English very well. So it was a sink or swim situation. So pretty much either they failed or they passed, and which is why the father made a big deal about it. These students had no opportunities for help or accommodations made for them since they knew very little English. They were either going to pass or they weren't, and after the court's decisions to give these students equality when it came to language and being able to comprehend. The U.S. Department soon made flow remedies, which applied to all school districts. Flow remedies requires bilingual education programs for students whose first language was not English. So for the, sorry, I can't see, implications, I put students who are ELL will be given extra help in order to understand and comprehend their schoolwork instead of being thrown into the class to pretty much sink or swim. And limitations for ELL learners, schools were not given any standards, so it was never understood what should be taught to make an ELL transition easier. So I read that like the staff and the administration of the school, they were kind of confused because the court never really gave them any standards to go by. So they expected them to, I guess, be able to teach and academically, help these ELL learners understand. But they didn't like give them any like materials or anything to help the administration. So that's where I found that kind of interesting. And they never really gave them anything. So. And then the next one was Castaneda versus Pickard in 1978. So the key points that I put was this case originated in Texas. The plaintiffs had charged the school district, which was Raymondville Independent School District, as they were not doing their job in addressing the needs of ELL students, which was mandated by EEOA. The court ended up being in favor of the school district because they believed that they were violating rights. And in 1981, Castaneda's appeal to the court ruled in favor, establishing a three-part assessment for bilingual programs. So at the beginning of the court, they actually favored in Raymondville's favor instead of Castaneda. And so he went back and he appealed because he felt like that wasn't fair and it wasn't right. So then in 1981, finally, the court, they favored in his favor, which was then when the court said that they were going to give a three-part assessment for bilingual programs. And this program, they stated that it must be based on a sound educational theory, and it should be implemented effectively with resources, personnel, materials, and space. And the program must be proven to have worked when overcoming language and special ed. So the implementation, okay, you know what I'm trying to say, I can't say it. The three-part assessment could potentially help students comprehend more and help them understand their materials, which would show that they were overcoming their language barriers. And for special education, I put that the three-part assessment could potentially help students comprehend more as well as overcome their learning disabilities. But for the limitations, students had to meet these requirements to show that the program was effective in overcoming ELL. And I kind of put that as a limitation because some students, when you take assessments, some students, they may be like smart and learning in the classroom, but when it comes to tests, they may have like, anxiety when it comes to tests. So like that might look bad if they're not doing good on their assessments, but they're doing good in the classroom. So that's kind of like the limitation I thought. And then students had to meet these requirements to show this program was effective in special ed, which again, same thing that I just talked about.
So the Americans with Disabilities Act amendments, this act was made in July of 1990. It was based on the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, but gave a larger extension of individual rights. This law protects all individuals with disabilities from discrimination and requires employers to make reasonable accommodations for these individuals. Some implications of this amendment is that through ADA, schools must be accessible to those with disabilities. So, for example, if a student in a wheelchair, ramps and elevators must be accessible to that student. And some limitations are that it is not required to provide free or appropriate education or develop an individualized educational program for students with disabilities. That's everyone.
Proposition 227 was in 1998. Some of the key points include that this is the English for Children initiatives, and bilingual classes were mostly gone from schools in California. Some of the implications include for ELLs that primary language of students were restricted, so they weren't able to use their primary language as often. And some of the limitations were that ELL students learn English at a slower rate and perform at lower levels.
Okay. And No Child Left Behind, which was in 2001. The key points that I put was this act was an act towards individuals with disabilities in education. States were required to have students take tests from grades 3 to 8 in reading and math, and one time in high school. No Child Left Behind is federally funded. Tests must be given to all students to determine how efficient the school is when spending their funds. This act requires students to be taught their regular grade level curriculum, as well as English, and states are required to have standards for English language proficiency, and those standards are supposed to meet the state's academic content standards. Because of this act, schools were required to track their students' progress. For the implications, I put this act required students' progress to be tracked, and I believe this could have made more teachers of these students to be more determined and more focused, especially because they knew that, that their students' progress was going to be tracked. So maybe this pushed those teachers to work a little bit harder and to be more focused. And I put pretty much the same thing for special ed. And for the limitations, the scores of students determine whether the school is efficient with their federal funds. And then not all students were able to meet requirements because of their disabilities. So the same thing with the testing, like I said before, kids could be doing good in the classes, and then when it comes to the test, they may not pass. And for special ed, not all of these students were able to meet the requirements because of their disabilities. So I feel like that was kind of unfair, because if they have a disability and they're unable to meet their requirements, I don't think that that should be required.
Every Student Succeeds Act was in 2015, and it's going to present day. The key points that it keeps the needs of the No Child Left Behind Act, but also allows for more flexibility from schools. And Title I, it requires annual testing for subjects for grades 3 through 8 and high school. And Title III has no distinction between bilingual and non-bilingual programs, and just requires ELLs to be in language instruction programs. Some of the implications of this could be the progress of education and level is tracked and measured for each student, so you know where the child is and that it's measured and you can continue to see their growth. And some of the limitations could be that bilingual education's social and personal benefits do not have any recognition.
So the Andrew F. Douglas County School District, this was in 2017, and it started because of a boy named Drew who had autism, was making little progress education-wise in public school. His parents then enrolled him in a private school where he was far more successful. And then his parents wanted the school district to reimburse him for the tuition costs because he was doing